Discerning the Forms. I'm Nick, and I'm here with Charles Howell. How are you doing, Charles?
I'm good. Back again.
Yes, we're glad to have you back, and this topic will be really interesting, and it sounds like you've been working on this for a little bit, and so we're going to talk about theology and architecture. So, that's kind of funny because I think a lot of listeners might not. I mean, maybe they do, but I think a lot of folks don't associate theology with architecture, which actually is kind of a strange thing because for so much of church history, thinking about sacred spaces was a big topic, and I think still is in a lot of churches. Is still a big topic, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, what the relationship is, and maybe why it's briefly why it's left modern conversation. I mean, or in evangelical circles or something.
Yeah, I think. Well, that's a big question. Let me just reaffirm your basic premise that sacred spaces have been central to Christianity, and it goes before Christianity to Judaism. The temple was the place where God met with His people, and God gave Solomon or David, and then ultimately Solomon blueprints for a temple. Ezekiel got blueprints for an eschatological temple. In Revelation, John got blueprints for another future temple. So, a place where God meets with His people is throughout the Bible, and in it, the importance of architecture, for various reasons, is sustained until the last several hundred years. I think that probably if you had to narrow it down to a single reason why that's lost in certain contexts, like the evangelical West, it's a shift in ecclesiology, where the emphasis now is that the people are the church, and God is wherever you are, and God's it's this notion that what really matters is your personal faith, and there's no other contextual or mediatory influences to that faith, that is between you and God, and it's personal, and so you don't even have to go to church. You can you don't even have to meet online. You just develop your faith as you want it, or as God's calling you to do
in your prayer closet.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that is strange. I mean, there's some things I still talk about that as pastor sometimes, like, hey, you are the church. And I think because there's theological reasons that people are the living temple. But I mean, I don't want to communicate that means there's no sacred spaces, because that would be strange from a biblical perspective. And that's interesting you bring that up, that it's a carryover from Judaism to be interested and think about theological space. Now, what is you're working on you've worked on a paper with this. What has it been like, just you working on a theology of architecture? What has that been like for you?
Yeah, so for me personally, it stems. I worked in architecture for the better part of a decade, which is actually how I, came to move to Gillette and all that.
That's interesting.
And so this article it's for a special edition of Spiritus Journal, and it's on contemplation and the arts, essentially. And the contributors, we were all given different arts to talk about how contemplation relates to these things. And I got architecture, which surprisingly is a rather straightforward approach than some of the other contributors. Like Taylor Worley has Contemplation and Conceptual Art, which is a much more thorny issue. Or Cutter Calloway has an article on Contemplation and Film, which again, for architecture though, it's been decided for 2,000 years how contemplation relates to architecture, and it's through this driving organizing principle of architecture called proportion. Vitruvius, who's a Roman architect, a philosophy of architecture, 1st century BC, has a book called 10 books, the 10 books on architecture. There's a Renaissance, another Renaissance book that's architecture in 10 books. So it's I have to remember which one's which. Yeah, but Vitruvius, one of the first things he says, is proportion is this driving principle that organizes architecture. And then he's writing in Latin, and he makes the statement, proportion in Greek is analogy. So architecture proportion, what proportion does in architecture is exactly what analogy does in theology and metaphysical thought.
Okay, interesting. So it's referring back to God in each and in how we think about space, analogically. Excuse me. Interesting. So when we're getting into the subject, where do you start? Where does it, you mentioned the book by this did you say Roman author?
Vitruvius.
Yeah, interesting.
Which, look, Vitruvius, so it sounds like obscure, but I'm sure that you've seen Leonardo da Vinci's sketch of a man with his arms and legs outstretched inside a circle. That's called the Vitruvius Man. And he drew that trying to solve an issue in architectural proportion while reading this book by Vitruvius. And this book is it's been used even in modern architecture. Le Corbusier has a whole different concept called the modular man, where he tries to modernize this concept. The system that Vitruvius puts out. So it sounds obscure, but it's really not. But for the theology of architecture, historically, most people associate this with the idea that cathedrals are somehow based on theological principles, and that's definitely one form. Most contemporary forms of theology of architecture come within the field of theology and the arts. The most recent example is by Murray Ray, who his book is just called Theology of Architecture. It was published maybe 2017, 2018. And Murray Ray is a Trinitarian theologian. He's at University of Auckland in New Zealand, but he did his undergrad in architecture. And so he uses theology and architecture for him as a way that theology can participate in conversation with different themes in philosophy of architecture or architectural theory.
Interesting. So, what about as you get into this literature, what is it that are we accomplishing when we think of architecture in space and theology?
Yeah, I think so. There's two different, parts of this answer. So one is, how does theology relate to architecture? The other is, what does place and space have to do with anything? Let's start with that latter part question just for a second, because it's a little bit more straightforward. So for much of the history of the West, especially modern thought, time has become such a focus that space is often left behind. This is especially true for the last 200, 300 years, where history becomes a big topic. So it becomes about how we've progressed. The Enlightenment is the great movement out of the past into maturity. The most influential philosophy book of the 20th century is Heidegger's Being and Time. Merleau-Ponty, like, even though his accounts is based on the body, he does have a section on space, just like Heidegger does. But it's really about how does the ego or the body synthesize time. Time is the main category. In the 60s, mainly in Germany, there starts what's referred to as the spatial turn. And this guy, Otto Ballo, wrote a book called Mensch und Raum, Human and Space, which was a critical response to Heidegger's Being and Time. And it was meant to emphasize space in the way that Heidegger emphasized time. And that started a new emphasis on the meaning of place and space. And that dovetailed with rising ecological concerns and concerns about natural world. So that then came into theology, and people like Moltmann, Sigurd Bergmann, Philip Sheldrake, and David Brown, eventually into the British guys. But that's part of what's going on with contemporary theology architecture is a new emphasis on space and place. And roughly, space is more abstract, place is more concrete. So we're in these certain places right now talking, and those places are within a more abstract concept of space, is usually how those terms work. The other side of that is then how does theology relate to architecture and relate to this rising importance of place, or this rediscovered importance of place? And Sigurd Bergmann has 3 different ways that theology can relate to architecture. So he has some and messes with the prepositions between the terms. So theology of architecture is like a theological critique on styles of architecture. And we'll just run through these. Theology in architecture is a question of how does the architecture, the types of buildings that we live in and dwell in, shape our conceptions of God and of theological matters. Is there a relationship? Does theology look different if you are a monk in a monastery versus an evangelical in office building? The third way he identifies as theology as architecture, which this is the sense that architecture can convey theological meanings through its design and through its construction.
That's interesting, and it's interesting you brought up that contrast of being in an office space versus some intentional structure. So what is it we're getting when we're in these different spaces? It's just kind of a side question of mine. When we're in these different spaces, how do they communicate God differently?
Yeah, and this goes probably to a question in architectural theory on what is architecture.
Yeah.
So it becomes thornier.
Back to the basics. Yeah.
Well, because it really depends on how you see the influence of what architecture is determines how it's going to be influenced, or how it influences thoughts and our meanings. If it's in a purely sort of aesthetic sense, then it doesn't have much influence whatsoever. It's just something looks pretty or not.
Yeah. Okay. You go to the doctor's office and they make it look welcoming. Yeah.
One of the most popular and kind of driving theories of architecture right now is based on Heidegger's sense of dwelling, and it's Karsten Harries calls it the ethical function of architecture. And what he argues is that architecture actually shapes our, what he calls ethical sensibilities, but our kind of disposition, our starting point. Charles Taylor in Secular Age, in the chapter on immanent frame, talks about how the layouts of cities has shaped the social imaginary, so that when we even begin to think, period, any thought, we start from a different place than we used to.
Oh, interesting.
And that's, I think there's something in there. The question then is, how much does it influence and what does it influence? And those are the types of questions which theology and architecture addresses.
Okay. So, so did you just tell me what architecture is? Like what?
No. So,
but I am thinking about it. I'm thinking like, okay, like the places, the maps, the spaces I'm in, creates some kind of, not just it's not just like a directions, like a neural map of directions in my head, but orientation. Is kind of what I'm thinking. So, okay, so what is architecture?
Yeah, so the modern debate, and this is 20th century debate, it's typically posed between a shed. A bike shed actually becomes the paradigm example that an engineer or a contractor can build. And that is, well, then what does architecture add to that bike shed? Now, let's say bike shed is just the most primitive. It's 4 posts and something to cover the bikes. How is architecture different than that? And that's the basis of the question. There are 4 different ways that question can be answered. So the first is in a classical sense. So architecture is metaphysical. It brings not only a beauty to the bike shed, but it brings an overall order which mirrors or imitates a metaphysical ordering. And so architecture should be just as driven by, let's say, contemplation or rational reflection as metaphysics or as science or as any of the other disciplines should be. Another answer to that question is that it's just purely aesthetic, and all that architecture brings to a bike shed is decor, is it decorates it with a certain style. Another answer to that is that architecture is semiotic. So what it actually is a type of language, and it communicates through its style. And then the final answer is the ethical or the ontological sense that I was describing, the Carson Harry has.
Okay, interesting.
That he says that the way the bike shed would be designed actually communicates meaning and shapes the way that we understand the world.
So I
tend
grab
to
that. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just to side or derail you for a second. I think I tend to think of it in those first few senses, but not the ethical sense always. Unless someone's intending it that way, like political art or something. But I always think of. I can see. I definitely have thought about it semiotically. Like the spaces are signing something to me. And in the context of church, if there's a cross there, I mean, it's obvious that its placement is meant to bring something to mind to me. But you bringing up the ethical, I mean, I guess I can see that, but it's not something we think about all the time. But sorry, you're going to go on.
Yeah, I was already say that's the only way I think about it. I think.
Really, that's interesting.
But maybe I'm just being corrupted. Well, I mean, it is.
You read all those books, Charles.
Well, I think. Well, even though in practicing architecture, when we would design, let's see, if I designed a bank and I designed a doctor's office, the layout, the size of the rooms, the materials are all reflective of the function of that building. And what was part of the design process is to exhibit a certain ethical order to each building. So when you walked in, there was a certain, let's say, immediate understanding of what was supposed to be taking place, what kind of activity was supposed to happen in these spaces. And part of hiring an architect is to accomplish this well. So you don't necessarily want a bank to feel or seem like a doctor's office when you walk inside. You want there to be a recognizable difference between the two, and those recognizable differences are based in culture and all those more relative things. It isn't. This is what distinguishes this ethical understanding of architecture from a metaphysical one. But it doesn't mean that they're all reducible to just cultural elements either. There's something else going on where culture is itself being defined as these buildings are being built.
Hmm.
And this is actually an insight of, well, should I say an insight? This is one of the driving questions of modern architecture. Modern architecture starts turn of the 20th century. So the first few decades, really, it picks up after World War One, when Europe has to be rebuilt in some sense for the first time, and then you can, more of the well-known modern architects, Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe and Van Dozenberg, they are doing these crazy things in the 20s and 30s with architecture. Van der Rohe has a famous house that's all the walls are glass and you can see straight through it. And the only solid walls are a little area in the center that define the bathroom, and everything else you can see straight through.
Thank goodness they didn't put see-through walls in the bathroom.
Yeah, well, they probably did at some point. Towards the 30s, that same group of people that were doing all these crazy things with modern architecture started to predict World War II. I mean, they could see it on the horizon.
Weird.
And they realized that Europe was going to call on them, because they're the leaders of architecture at that moment, to rebuild Europe. And they questioned whether what they were doing had enough substance to redefine the culture of Europe that was going to be devastated in World War II. So they shifted their whole way of doing
33-degree masons or something? No.
Yeah. No. But this is, I think Le Corbusier is one of the more radical transitions where he goes back to something that looks much more traditional. He has a famous chapel. Yeah, I wish I had pictures of all this. But he has a famous chapel that looks much more traditional. But he started really working on a theory of proportion to try to.
How do you spell his name? I might be able to share a screen capture or something.
So Le, L-E, and then Corbusier, I think.
Should be close enough to.
Yeah, if you just Duchamp Chapel.
Oh, I see. There's a lot of pictures of him. Oh, what chapel did you say?
I think it's called Duchamp.
Spell that right.
Ronchamp. Yeah, if you just search Le Corbusier Chapel, it'll come up.
Oh, this weird looking like mushroom looking thing.
Well, I mean, they're Dutch.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me see if I can screen share.
But the point of saying all that is what was. Oh, and all these modern architects were working with the De Stael group and the beginning of abstract art. So they were working alongside people like Mondrian and Kandinsky. Mondrian is the artist that has essentially different, like, red and blue and yellow squares on canvases. And the whole point of abstract art was to stress like aesthetic creativity and aesthetic freedom. And they realized, heading toward World War II, that they needed to base this on something more substantial than just the expression of creativity. That they needed to think about how this was going to influence cultural sensibilities and our sense of ethical responsibility. So this is the shift in there, and this movement comes out of that called new monumentality.
Can you see this when I'm sharing?
Yeah.
What is this? Is this part of it? This
That's
this
just an
window,
interior view. Yep.
Wow. Yeah, that is really interesting.
That
Sorry, go
shows
ahead.
the scale. So outside, the scale doesn't look that big, but you could
Here's
see all the windows.
Yeah, here's like doors. Is this the same
Yep.
building? Looks kind of,
Yep.
yeah. So that would be a proportion image. Interesting. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
But so the question of how does architecture influence us, or what is architecture?
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, so unless you're going to ground architecture in metaphysics and just do classical architecture over and over and over, which I think ignores one of the defining features of modern architecture, which is technological advancement. The Industrial Revolution, for the first time, architecture could break free from the physical limitations of materials. Before steel, aluminum, these alloys were invented, you could only build spans that wood or concrete could carry the load.
Mm-hmm.
So architecture was limited to like the natural limitations of materials. Industrial Revolution, especially with steel and reinforced concrete, were the two big advancements. The end of the 19th century. Now it's crazy what architecture can do with aluminum and lighter alloys. But that all of a sudden architecture has a new range of possibilities. And part of the question was, how do you navigate that? So unless you're going to go back and just stick to a metaphysics, which ignores now the technological possibilities, and also the fact that maybe some of these technological advancements are actually more economical and more ecologically friendly, then you have to entertain the question, uh, which of the other forms of architecture best fit what's going on? Semiotic seems like it could, except I just think that semiotic repeats the sort of logocentrism. It doesn't give architecture an equal place in how it shapes things. So it just becomes, well, architecture does communicate something, but it's more clear if you put it in words. So let's not really worry about architecture. Let's hang signs on the wall that tell you where to go instead of letting the building direct your movement.
Yeah, I think that there's a way that if you just had that logocentric semiotic perspective, you would get kind of these cheeky signs. Like they would be too obvious, like you would almost like offensive to our senses if we reduced it down to just a semiotic. You know what I mean? Like you would walk in, and maybe that's what we do in modern in our sort of evangelical sacred spaces. There's just a cross. I'm thinking of my own church built. There's just a cross, like slap right in the middle. It's so obvious because it's meant to communicate something very specific and for no one to make mistakes about that. But it's actually not reaching the core to some kind of real sense of being swept away by the space.
Yeah, I think if you think, so one of the classical functions of architecture, of proportion in architecture, was to bring out a unified expression of something. In the Greek temple, each temple was designed for the god that was supposed to be housed there. So they would use different characteristics. They had these things called orders, which were like building standards of scale and ratios and dimensions, and they would choose those based on the god that they were trying to exploit, so that the whole building had a disposition which matched the god that was to be venerated there. if so, that single expression is lost in late or starting maybe the middle of the 20th century, when the driving concern of building became economics. So what that turns into in like the American evangelical world is that you have an office building, a literal office building, and what makes it a church is a sign out front that says so and so church.
Yeah.
There's nothing else about it. Now maybe you hang a cross in there, but what if in small town you walk in a doctor's office and they have a cross there? Does that make that a church? Is that enough? Now, the activity, I guess, is a big part of it, which is getting to what architecture is. That architecture isn't
when I was in Eastern Europe, you'd go into a public building like a government building, and you would see icons there. I mean, so, but that doesn't make it a church. That's just that's just it's a different space, and it too when you walk in there.
Yeah. And that's I mean, we still have different spaces. Let's say in America, they're typically courthouses or government buildings that are reserved for a different type of architecture, where you walk in and something important is going on.
This is a state building. Yeah. Interesting. Sorry, you were going on. You were taking us on a journey here, and I lost track.
I don't even know where we were.
You don't know where we were. I think what triggered my question was thinking about or my comment was thinking about how going back to this place of like not just having an offensive symbolic experience, but like taking us into deeper sensibilities with the space in architecture. So what is that like? We're thinking about like how things are everything matters, like even proportion, size, place, the room. I think of like some why do we go into church buildings and there's a giant high ceiling, those kinds of things. All of it resonates and matters, I think, for the architect, right? So someone building, you think of I can't say his name, but the guy you were mentioning, who's thinking, man, we gotta, whatever we do matters, and it's going to shape the future. So how we build this space matters. I mean, that's just fascinating to think about. Someone, thinking at that level about this proportion, size, and so forth.
Yeah. That's really, I mean, that's what architects do. I mean, today
it is.
In practicing architects, unless you have the privilege of being an architect for clients who actually have money, 90% of your decisions are made by either building codes, local and federal building codes, or by the dimensions of the materials that you can get. So most rooms are 8 foot tall because an 8 foot 2x4 or 8 foot steel stud is cheaper than any other size. And so it kind of, it's the whole manufacturing industrial complex is driving what proportion, but the architects that we know are ones who think of these bigger questions, and they think about the relationship between the built world, the natural world, and human freedom or human autonomy, the human spirit, how they all relate. And theology should add an extra dimension on that, which is then the relationship between this entire created realm and God.
What does it mean then? I'm just thinking about now church history, and when you go from house church to basilica, what does, I mean, because then all of a sudden Christians have to start thinking intentionally, But what was it like thinking about the space being in your home versus the basilica?
When, like historically?
Yeah,
Yeah.
historically. So I'm thinking early church, during times when it was mainly you had sort of business folks opening up their home in an apartment type building where Christians were meeting and gathering basically in an extension of a home versus once they actually got to make decisions about the space. Or did they? Is that a way to look at it? Or have Christians kind of been organically sort of taking spaces and reimagining them? Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it goes from a home, we take it, we reimagine it, then all of a sudden Christianity is legalized and then made state religion, and so we get these new spaces. Now we're reimagining it from Temple of Artemis to Temple of or to Church of Saint Mary or something.
Yeah. And I think that maybe answered your question is as soon as Christianity could move into the biggest buildings that existed at the time, which were basilicas, they did. I mean, there was before, like before Constantine and that whole thing.
Do we redeem spaces? Sorry to interrupt you there, but is that kind of what we do? Yeah.
So that's one way to think about that. And Murray Reagan, his book on theology and architecture, has a whole chapter that discusses that how the church came and overtook Greek architecture, and that's a way that we can think about kind of our participatory role of redeeming the creation besides Christ, like what we're doing now. It becomes a model. I think most practically though, what the Greeks and Romans figured out was how to fit a bunch of people in a building. and that's what it came down to, and that's what drove Christianity from the beginning was community. So it was, where can we fit the most people, and the buildings almost had to be tall because the arches that were needed to span these distance had to go up a certain number, a certain proportion. So they needed to be big. Probably the most decisive architectural invention that comes from theology is the Gothic cathedral. So Romanesque architecture essentially what the Romans were building in the first century existed until the 12th century. Gothic architecture, which is characterized by, they replaced the semicircle arch of Romanesque architecture with a pointed arch. And what that allowed to do is it redistributed the weight so that you didn't need these massive walls on either side of the arch. You could put windows in there. So stained glass became but what was going on at the time, so this Gothic style was invented by this guy, Suge, who was an abbot at the Abbacy of St. Denis, which is Pseudo-Dionysius. So he's reading Pseudo-Dionysius, and
interesting.
And Denis has in divine names, it's all about like this apophatic theology because God is light. So we can know God because, like, we can know light exists, but not because you can see God the same way you can't see light, but because of that you see everything else. So he's reading this. There's some stuff going on. This happened outside Paris. There's some stuff going on politically with the monarchy in Paris and France and what's going on. But he's reading this and decides that he wants to remodel that abbey that he's at, based on this principle of light. And so that's the pointed arch helps him open up the walls and accomplish this. What's interesting about all that, and maybe ties to what we were talking about earlier, Richard Padovan, who's just an architectural theorist, he doesn't do any theology. He points out that the Gothic style predates scholasticism by a century. So oftentimes Gothic is thought that
Yeah.
It's supposed to reflect the scholastic principle of highest order, and everything's supposed to point up. The abbey starts to be remodeled 100 years before Aquinas is born. So
Interesting.
it seems like it's actually the other way around, that Gothic architecture starts to shape scholastic theology. Now, the kind of controlling factor is both Aquinas and Suge are reading Pseudo-Dionysius. Aquinas quotes from Pseudo-Dionysius more than any other theologian. So he's probably the source of both of these. But the architecture does predate the theology, at least during that period.
See, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating to me that it's bringing in like Neoplatonism and and thought that was sort of building on the horizon there, but then anticipates and shapes future theology. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was to say the other thing that's explicitly Christian is, one of the questions with architecture is, how do you, like, so a theory of proportion is somewhat theoretical. It's a, just like analogy, it's a relationship of terms. You have to have some way to measure those terms, some tape measure. And there's different systems for how this happens. What is unique to Christian theology or Christian architecture in the medieval period is that they're drawing from biblical measurements to do this. So their standard is the measurement that
scripture.
God gave for one of those temples recorded in the Bible. So they start, like the Cathedral in Amiens is laid out with Solomon's dimensions, and that's become a controlling factor. So yeah, those two ideas, Pseudo-Dionysius and then this biblical source and measurement, are probably Christianity's unique contribution. One more comment on that. Le Corbusier has this book, The Modular, he's writing in the 30s. Maybe it's later than that. But he realizes, so that question about how the technology kind of disrupts the possibilities of architecture. We have to readdress the question of, how does human ingenuity, human creativity relate to architecture, because we don't have to tie it to the natural world. He realizes that this matters for the way we measure buildings, and he targets the development of the metric system during the French Enlightenment as the like hinge point between this. And he starts off this book, The Modular, says we got a problem. For most of the history of the world, we based measurements on the human. So a cubit is roughly the size of a forearm, or the foot. It's roughly the size of a foot. All of a sudden, the metric system, which is based on the equator of the Earth, the circumference of the equator of the Earth, it's 1/40th, 1/400th of that, or something. Maybe it's less, smaller number, but that's what the meter is. So it's measured by the diameter of the Earth, not by the human. And he says, so how do we reconcile this? He has this great quote. He's like, because there is no 1 meter or 2 meter human. And so he tries to develop a theory that reconciles those two things. And that actually becomes another topic of discussion of modern architecture, about which measurement systems should we use to ground our theory of proportion.
Oh, interesting. So, I think thinking back to the earlier notion of evangelicals building buildings, or basically redeeming spaces, I wonder, I think what happens and maybe this is a tell, but in American Christianity, when evangelical Christians are allowed to build spaces with money, they model it off of other buildings they're familiar with, rather than going to this like other place to get a source of measurement, meter, size, that's interesting to me. Why are we doing that? Like, what is the drive? Like, why are we building entertainment centers that have, like, when we're free to build buildings, why aren't they Gothic cathedrals, and why are they concert halls. I don't like. That's so weird to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it expresses the ethics, the disposition of that place, of that culture.
What is it saying then? What
Well,
is it saying?
more than saying,
Not just semiotics. Yeah. What is it?
yeah.
Committing
Like
us to be.
I think what it's doing is revealing
What's in our
values. Revealing, you could say in your heart. I would say in culture's heart, in the social identity, the social imaginary. It's revealing what we hold to be important.
Because you hear people say excuses like, "Yeah, we got to reach the culture. We got to reach the people, the 20-somethings or whatever." Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. That's weird. All of a sudden, everything gets strange when you start talking about this. What? Okay, so you're talking about where do we ground, the measurements? What's my tape measure notches? Where do I get those from? And you said we've shifted from it being about the human to being about the Earth's circumference or whatever. What's going on there? What does that mean?
Europe has done that with the metric system. America is still holding on strong to the foot and inch system.
Foot and inch. So it's still based on a human, or roughly a foot. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, but like I said, construction and architecture is driven by economics. There's no way around that now.
Right.
Most, unless you have extremely wealthy clients.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think for Christians, to be fair, when they take up when a church plant, because I went to a Lutheran church plant that was in one of the towns that is near us, and we visited, and they're taking it was interesting because it was a Lutheran church, so it was but it was downtown in a strip mall area, but you walk in and then they're trying to set it up like a Lutheran church. So I feel like that you're right. It's economics, it's pragmatics, but they're again just not, they're redeeming spaces, but they're not free like they were in the medieval time with Gothic art. They're not free to build the buildings they want, with all that intention.
Yeah, even then though, like Suge, he's remodeling a 9th century Romanesque cathedral. It's on a grander scale, but he's not starting from scratch. And he has a book recording kind of the whole process of how he.
But are they getting like funding from emperors or kings or whatever?
Yeah, but the funding is even limited for him. And there's this one part where he needs this one wooden beam that's large enough to span this distance. And he's asking all these like peasants if they know of any tree big enough in around the area they're building it, because he can't afford to ship a tree big enough to there. And he he records a miracle, and this is part of his kind of testimony that this is God's will.
Interesting.
He had a dream of where the tree was, so he set out and they found the tree near where the cathedral was. But so even then there's limitations, and I don't think it's one of the chapters that Mary Ray has on this is how architecture is it's an interesting art because it's limited by statics. It's limited by the branch of physics which deals with how things hold up to each other. So you can't it isn't like a lot of, let's say, it has stricter limitations than a lot of the other arts. But what is even despite those limitations or alongside those, there is a sense of creativity that I think Christians could draw from theology and develop spaces that do more than just make it suitable enough to have a gathering at some point. Now, like, my architect mind is, I can't imagine how a strip mall could ever be an architecturally inviting like
well,
church.
maybe that's one of the limitations someone has to work with, and then they got to find that tree. They got to have a dream of a tree,
Yeah. I've never seen any strip mall, period, no matter what it is, that's aesthetically pleasing. I think it's the scourge of the earth. And what's ironic is we don't build strip malls anymore.
I know,
like
they're
the
all
suburbs are actually a problem. So society has figured this out, and I'm all for it. We'll figure out some other, new urbanism will give us the next church, I guess.
Yeah. Although, yeah. So now I'm interested, though. Sometimes I'm interested in things that are spontaneous versus intentional. How would you think of that in the context of limitations and space, and how would an artist work with that? Because you might inherit a strip mall, but then a church has to figure out what they're going to do.
Yeah, if you inherit a whole strip mall, you have more possibilities for making it look like something.
Exactly. Interesting. Yeah. I'm trying to find ways to not put the blame on all of the congregations that wind up into this, because I think there's a sense, again, where they want to redeem space, but we just have but at the same time, we're just not thinking at that level. We're not using those gifts and talent. Yeah, I think of in the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit influenced architects to build the temple, and we're just not. We want people to be spirit filled to speak in tongues, but we don't want architects. Why is that?
No. Yeah, and we don't even think it isn't even a question.
We don't even think it's a spiritual gift.
Yeah, not like.
I'm not trying to be Pentecostal here. Just, you know what I mean. But
yeah, most decisions, you've already alluded to this. Most decisions of what a church should do aesthetically is driven by the most popular and most successful church in their area. And that's just what it is. Like it's in the most popular or successful church is the ones who have money to kind of explore new
ground,
ways to do things. But they're I mean, and a lot of churches are, to be fair, a lot of evangelical churches are having sort of a design team or a creative kind of.
Oh yeah.
So
but they always want to put the crates in the background or something, rather than.
And it's because they saw someone else do it, and so instead of asking, what's actually going on, what's the point of the church, and maybe, crates aren't the best. Well, I mean, even that's just decor. Like that's different than architecture, because architecture we're talking about a much more.
I've heard someone try to make a theological case for crates, and that's always stayed with me.
Yeah, that's fun. It shows. Maybe it shows.
No.
Yeah, it shows their sort of their impetus for metaphysics, or what they think metaphysics is.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. I derailed you somewhere, and I'm desperately trying to remember where we were.
Yeah, I can't. I think. I mean, and that's probably the.
So there's
the biggest. I mean, maybe one of the defining characteristics of evangelical America is.
So there's a history that's got us there. There's a history that took us there. What is that? How do we shift from medieval interesting buildings to whatever we're doing now?
Well, it's. I mean, I don't think that medieval is the standard that I would point to that what architecture should be.
Okay, yeah, because they
So,
were getting that
so
from earlier sources,
yeah, but even then, I don't think that every church has to be like Gothic
medieval.
or
Yeah.
Romanesque. Yeah. And
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I think there are some fascinating churches.
Okay, I want to come back, put a
modern.
pin in that, because I want to know how this resolves for church plant. You know what I mean? Like, but we'll stick a pin in that. But anyways, keep going. What is the shift though that takes us historically from this intentional building space to what's going on now? There's a timeline, right?
Well, I mean, so architecturally,
Mm-hmm.
well, there's still.
Is it all technology? Like we got this
No,
new
because there's
way to build a building? Yeah.
no, because there's plenty of modern architects, modern buildings that people would say are masterpieces.
Yeah.
I mean, so let's say in American context, Frank Lloyd Wright, his Prairie style, which uses steel reinforced concrete slabs. There's Frank Lloyd Wright's famous house of falling water. There's this house like built over top of a waterfall, and it has these cantilever like balconies that come off of it, and it matches the landscape. His whole idea was architecture should take its cues from its natural context. So he would use like local materials like rocks and things and local colors that mimic the nature. So it looks like that building grew out of the ground, and he needed technological advancements to do that. So there's still what plenty of people would say is architectural achievements in modern styles. The issue becomes, I think, that it becomes a lot cheaper to build modular kind of buildings. So going to Home Depot and using the materials that are available there, which takes all the decisions of proportion out of design. Because like I said, you're using 8-foot tall studs. So you've already got a height determined, and you have to pay not only like a little bit extra, but exponentially extra to have an off-size room.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, just the general lack of theological reflection that happens in American evangelicals towards the end of the 20th century, for whatever those reasons are. It's never. I mean, I've been in several churches that are deciding to do something aesthetically or remodeling or even painting.
Mm-hmm.
And if you bring up, well, why don't we think about what this can mean theologically? You just push to the side. The question is, does it look good and is it cheap? And that's the only two questions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, was there a what was there a shift during the Enlightenment that leads us away from thinking this way, more economics and
No, I mean, this is a 20th century thing.
Pragmatics.
Well, I mean, just society changed in the 19th century with Industrial Revolution. The way we structure society, cities are organized differently. Suburbs become a thing, after World War II. Everything changes. There is in the 19th century. So, Renaissance is a huge movement away from Gothic style. So, think Italy, think Rome, neoclassical kind of buildings, but there's a big shift in Renaissance thought and the rise of humanism, and Cartesian turn takes its effect in architecture as much as it does philosophy or anything else. 19th century shows an explosion of like revival architecture. So, and there's Gothic revival there, and Greek revival. There's even like cool styles like Egyptian revival. One of the buildings here in St. Andrews for the university is built in Egyptian revival, which is a precursor to Art Deco. What has changed though is the cultural sensibilities. And I think
Yeah.
that Charles
Yep.
Taylor probably gets this the best, where it becomes fragmented. So no longer is there a single driving
Yeah.
set of presuppositions in Western culture. Everything becomes shaped by the particular culture. So then different styles come up, which isn't a bad thing. It just means that you have to take notice of what those cultural values are. And another point on the shift maybe from medieval to contemporary architecture
Mhm.
is there's a book, Otto von Simpson, who has a book on medieval cathedral he wrote it in mid 20th century, and it was the standard for understanding how cathedrals were built, how the proportions worked, and how the construction. He has a lot of work on how they were constructed too, and he talks about in there that it's hard to find the word architect in the medieval period. And it's because the word architect was reserved for someone who had mastered all the arts. And arts then meant theology and science and things like that. So there was architects used to be, let's say, the most educated, intelligent, and creative people there were. I mean, think of Da Vinci.
It wasn't specialized. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were these great theorists. They were. I mean, I'm trying to think of someone that we would associate with that role today. I'm not sure I can think. I mean,
Well, I
maybe
mean, I
someone
guess
like
I think of
Stephen
like C.S.
Hawking.
Lewis,
Yeah,
who,
yeah,
I mean, if he were an architect, he would bring in all sorts of things. Like he would bring in the classics, he would bring in esoteric, Christianity, everything. So
yeah. No, that's a good example, and how it's all back there, and he's writing children's novels.
yeah, and
Right.
and
So
yeah, you can't help
yeah,
but have that bleed into the novels. Yeah,
yeah, and that's the way architects used to be. Is architecture was based on philosophy or theology.
yeah,
So you had to know that it was based on science. You had to know physics to figure out how it works. It dealt with political theory. So you had to know the politics and what was considered norms at the time. All that stuff went into how you design a building. So and that sort of just like mastery over all these disciplines is gone too. But especially just in well, I'll refrain from beating up on the evangelical church anymore. It
it's
seems a
easy.
general
Yeah,
lack of reflectivity, like of
yeah,
theological reflection. Are these things important, and what does this not only communicate, but how does this shape us?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned it being fragmented. So, and we're in a place now where we have to start thinking intentionally, and because otherwise, what happens to me is this. What poisons the well for me is just kind of understanding this stuff. I can't go into certain spaces without thinking about like, oh, you modeled this off a Outback Steakhouse or an airport or or a shopping mall or something. So like, what was the intention with that? Like what do you, not just what are you signing, but how does this orient me in this space? And yeah, there's so much there. Do you so I do have some questions I want to think about for like modern application, but are there any other points you want to make or things you want to say before we
No, I think.
head
I
to
mean,
the end?
I will say I don't. I think I know what you mean by intention.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I
Yeah.
think though that at least architects are
Mhm.
thinking through these things,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
and just the way like one of the first things you do, like designing a building in architecture, is you do this thing called schematic design, and it usually just starts with like you take pieces of trace paper and you start drawing circles, and it's just flow diagrams for how the movement happens through whatever building you're designing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's based on part of it's just experience. So if you've done, let's say you've done a church before, like there's a certain movement, and there's places that are going to be bigger than other places,
Mm-hmm.
but those circles that on this trace paper are representing different architectural volumes that will naturally direct where you stop and where you start and where you want to head towards. And the master architects, the ones who create masterpieces, are ones that understand the way space works so well that they can make someone slow down their pace of walk as they turn a corner, based on the light, based on the size of the hallway, or based on what happens architecture. Without and that's when the power of architecture, how it shapes us and how it like reorganizes or reorients is a good word. Our values really starts to take place. And this is what cathedrals were. This is the effect they had. In some sense, this is what they were designed to do, although like the extravagance were reserved for certain cathedrals. Mainly, they just needed a building big enough to fit that, the whole town.
Yeah.
But so it's like architecture is still alive, and there's still master. I mean, Frank Gehry, who's a postmodern architect, right? He does the crazy. He did like Disney Concert Hall, the ones that are just like a bunch of shapes.
Oh yeah.
His space is still control movement. Yeah, and they still, you go stand in those spaces, and there's like an awe to them.
There's something, there's something telling culturally about we have all this beauty and architecture and the art going into Disney rather than a parish building. It's just so.
I mean, I think it's more to Christian evangelical culture than it is to culture wider than that. And I think that part of
I even think Catholic buildings, are they thinking about them that intentionally in America?
There's Vatican II kind of changed what the design could be for Catholic buildings. It opened it up to a modern stance, so it isn't going to be medieval like it was for centuries. But their modern Catholic buildings are there's still some great examples.
So there's about three questions. I don't know if I'll get to all of them before we close, but I guess the one that interests me right now is like, where do you see us going in the future? Like, how would someone strike out in the future? Do you see anything interesting going on right now that one both anticipates maybe what's going, like here we are on the verge of like World War III, like all sorts of crazy things, like God help us, are all, I hope there's not someone signing that buildings are all going to be blown up, but like, is there anything anticipating bringing the future now with architecture that you see in religious spaces through your studies?
No, I mean, not
that you could know, but if you had a guess.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So the big trends in architecture broader is ecological kind of buildings, and then
so we're moving from pragmatic to ecological.
Yeah, and there's still, I mean, like what will happen, there still has to be a cost trade-off. So what will happen is you would sacrifice square footage for sustainability is the way it happens. And then in more urban planning, new urbanism, which is kind of mixed use. So you have like
your 15-minute cities. What's that going to do?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
15-minute city.
But for church architecture, I mean, I think that the kind of the rediscovery of sacred spaces in Eastern Orthodoxy and then in Catholic and Anglican worlds, and how there's an exodus of American evangelicals to these things. I think that's telling, but I don't think it'll pick up. I think that the people. I don't think that it's readily understood that part of that attraction is not just the theology. Part of it is the presentation, is the architecture, is the aesthetics of that movement.
Now I'm I'm wanting to kind of bring it more local. So what would you so with what you've studied, how would you help like a church plant or a team of people like in a church congregation who they're wanting to be I keep saying intentional, but I feel like that's not even right, because I'm interested in where does spontaneity fit in to intentionality versus the logistics and pragmatics and so forth, because that's what we're dealing with now. You can't just like change the carpet and think about the theology of it, but you're but at the same time, I could hear someone wanting to bring this home to something more local, like what do we do locally about spaces, sacred spaces?
I would say you literally can raise theological reflection for changing the carpet.
Okay.
And I think
what would that look like?
I don't know. We have to figure. We have to think about this.
The colors,
some of it color pattern. What So like,
remember when churches used to be all purple and different? Well, because that meant something,
Yeah, because it meant royal. Regality. Yeah, it was at one point, purple and red were the most expensive things that you could have. The colors that you could have, the dyes. So church plant. So let me say this: all architecture works within limitations.
Yeah,
and so it's a false dichotomy to say only these people have limitations.
Only giant. So even the giant basilicas had limitations,
and that's why some of these basilicas are taking hundreds of years to be built. Because they had to raise funds as they were building. I think the number one thing, if you're a church plant thinking about how to develop a space, is to hire an architect, to spend the money, take it out of whatever budget you have, and develop some sort of plan for someone that understands how to use space, because it will if space matters, like we've been talking about, and if place adds meaning, then having a well-designed place will add meaning, certainly, augment the meaning of the activities happening there. And to a general question, kind of misinterpreting what you've said about spontaneity and determine, like
self-determination, someone's self-determined ideological input.
For most of architectural history, the question was, there's a free spirit of creativity in humanity. You need to bring that under order. The issue is too much spontaneity. So you bring that under order by ordering the spaces around you. So that speaks maybe to the ethical function of architecture, but thinking about what order you're bringing. And some of this happens. Actually, this does happen. When, like, the coffee shop is brought forward, and one of the first things that you see when you walk through the door is a coffee shop in this like cafe. It's ordered to be inviting, to be a place to hang out. So the ordering's already happening. The question is there, and there's probably some theological reflection. We want to, make this a place for people to want to be in, kind of thing.
Right.
I think maybe there's deeper questions of what is that? Is this a lasting value? Is the attractiveness of having something that people, participate in this moment of culture, is that what a church should be spending money on? Is there any thought? How long is Starbucks going to be the symbol of hospitality?
There's in my own church context, in our youth room, we had some students and an artist in our church help paint a bunch of murals that at one time kind of had some high point scenes of scripture. You had Moses and the Ten Commandments, and if I would have chose that, I would have put Abraham first. But they had the creation of the world, and then all these different scenes that lead up to Christ, and then the second coming. Well, what was interesting, we had to put a door into the youth room, and part of that project meant we had to paint over the creation mural, and we were trying to think about how we could repaint it or whatever. But I remember how gut wrenching it was for people, because it became it operated almost like icons do. It became a place where all that work put into it had spiritual significance, and just taking one of those pieces away, I even felt it like it was like a gut wrenching thing. Like, oh, we're getting rid of the. We'd make jokes like we're getting rid of creation, but but so I mean, to me during that time, it did really show me the significance of what it means for the community to have certain things in a sacred space. And as you lived into that in a worshiping context over the years. So you can see how all of this matters, how just like you said, ordering that creativity, and making the spaces, at least as much as we can, point back to Christ, point to the gospel. Is that kind of where you would go with it, at least? If you were working with a team of people, you'd say, hey, let's see how this points to Christ.
No, because that's one way to think about it. I think that's still the semiotic. Then architecture, the only value architecture has.
I can't get my head out of that frame. Yeah.
I would say, how is it shaping people? Because buildings, I think that buildings are already shaping
you into
people.
Something. Yeah.
Yes, they're already doing that.
Yeah.
So the question is, and I don't think, you can say, well, how do we then litter ideologies direct design? It's not that straightforward. I think it's a task of picking up
discipleship,
on cultural values, and how already places are shaping those values, and maybe emphasizing certain values over others.
Yeah, the word discipleship came to mind. Is that like what you're thinking about? I mean, not that. So I'm trying to be careful. I don't want to reduce it to something, because it probably brings in all of the elements. Like you said, the semiotics is still going to be part of it, but then also who we want to be in the future. But at the same time, it brings back to I think of Robert Weber's ancient future theology, where we're also we're not just doing what's cool now in the culture, but we're trying to think about what is one of the things, I guess, that I love about the Orthodox churches is that they feels like I'm walking into the book of Revelation, and I know that's intentional, or was intentional at some point. But it shapes you into the kind of Christian for worshiping in an Orthodox church, right?
Yeah,
There's discipleship.
It has you. Orthodox is a good example because their churches are so. The design is so consistent across the board.
Yeah, it's consistent. Byzantine.
Yeah.
Consistent.
I would say that just exposes the way that spaces shape us, and all spaces are doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not giving thought to how you're ordering the space, then you're just being swept along with the decisions you're making unreflectively. Disciple. I was going to say, the word that Paul uses kind of for discipleship is edify, which literally means to build. So
wow. Yeah, that brings it home.
Yeah, there's a sense that that our culture, or our artistic expressions, and then cultural artifacts in general, are shaping how we see the world, and how we not even how we see the world in this disadvantaged thing. They're shaping the starting point from when we start to reflect on anything, and that's what's at stake. So back to the semiotic thing, just as language, the language that we use, let's say the translation of the Bible we use, how that shapes then our understanding of theological matters. That's the same thing is going on in architecture.
Yeah, I know this. Maybe this is not what you mean, but I think I'm thinking of this way, like it being it already orienting me or putting me in a place for my thinking. I'm running programs, and what my experience is already there, or it has. So like when I think of a chair, I'm thinking of all the experiences I've had with chairs, furniture in my home growing up, those kinds of things. That becomes the backdrop or the context of thinking about an abstracted chair. That's a little bit, is that kind of what you mean? That's a little bit too.
I would say this right now, that all the things you're saying, you're sitting in a chair doing it. And that's the way architecture functions. It's not, you're not even thinking about the chair you're sitting in, but it's influencing how,
it's like a fish thinking about water. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're uncomfortable or not, or, if you're sitting more upright or not, it actually shapes how well you're thinking, how much you're paying attention. If it's too comfortable a chair, you'll start to fall asleep, like that sort of sense. And we know this in church. We already know. When a church is somewhere you want to be and when it's not, or when the certain parts of a church design are emphasized over others, so that you want to be in those parts and not others. And whether that is a misbalance between a coffee shop and a sanctuary.
Yeah. Well, in Jacques Ellul, when he talks about technology and space and the technological society, he brings up the way we used to stand in churches rather than sit, and how when they were thinking about it, they weren't thinking about like we need to have these people sitting in chairs. They were thinking about like this is a good aesthetic space for us now. We don't, they weren't thinking about the technique and trying to perfect it. They were perfecting something else, I guess. Is the way I'm kind of seeing it. But yeah,
I think most of it was you could fit more people in when they're standing up, and you didn't need to spend the money. Like it was more
that goes in there too. Yeah.
But that, Charles Taylor has this part of his story of secularization is he says that part of what held the world in this sort of metaphysical mode for a couple thousand years was there's these bulwarks, he calls them, these kind of things that hedged not only the kind of conditions of belief that we have today and the possibilities of disbelief, but they actually encouraged the metaphysical systems that were in place. And I think that would be an example of one. You're standing in church based on a purely a kind of common sense. You just didn't think about sitting down. Like the society wasn't comfortable like we are. People didn't have couches. The whole thing. But because you're standing in church, there was what we would see as a more respectful position of that. But I don't think that would be the intention, is to stand for respect.
So it shaped them, but it discipled them in that way to think that way, maybe.
Well, it helped to reinforce what was already there, which was this metaphysical respect. But a lot of traditions, let's say a lot of traditions that didn't come from Reformed or Anabaptist roots, you still stand up at certain times during that. Yeah. So the services are driven by liturgy, and the liturgy there's points where you stand up. Yeah. So it's not lost. It's lost in certain contexts. But even I guess you could say look at the charismatics, and they can't stay in their seats. So
Yeah.
even in theirs, and their whole buildings are designed, the spaces that they inhabit, which tend to be bigger auditoriums, so that they got room to run around and do all that stuff that they do.
Yeah. I actually think that would be an interesting conversation, is how that works in a Pentecostal context, because I think Amos Young has written about that, talking about liturgy and Pentecostalism. But yeah, so many interesting directions we could go. But thank you so much for this conversation. Any parting thoughts or words?
No, I mean, maybe just throw out a couple of resources. So Murray Ray is kind of the most recent development in theology architecture.
How do you spell Murray Ray? Because I like searched it and I get too much, so I'm not spelling it.
Let's see. Murray, and then Ray is Rae.
Okay, well, I did.
And then
pull that up right there.
Yeah, Sigurd Bergmann. His last name is Sigurd Bergmann. His last name is Bergmann. He's on a main voice. We'll just say that. Philip Sheldrake who's a British theologian. He does actually a lot of like mystical work in like mysticism and spirituality.
Yeah. See, I think that Anthony, you better take note of that, because you'll be interested.
Philip Sheldrake. He has a book called Spaces of the Sacred. That's one of the best descriptions of sacred spaces. Kind of an overview, introduction. It was his Husleyan lectures that he gave at Cambridge. And
sorry, what was his name?
Sheldrake.
How do I spell that?
Sheldrake. And there in Jennifer Allen Craft has a book, Placemaking in the Arts, where she doesn't deal with architecture directly, but the question of how place matters is throughout the book. And it's theology, art. She was a former student of Trevor Hart, and I think that her stuff is some of the most creative work being done in theology and the arts.
Is Bergmann's book Nature, Space, and the Sacred?
Yeah, that's one of them. He has one called Theology and Built Environments. That's actually an edited volume. That's proceedings from a conference, a theological aesthetics conference, that was kind of revisiting Balthasar and seeing what could be still valuable for present conversations in Balthasar. Theology and Built Environments. Timothy Gorange is another one. Theology in Built Environments is Gorange. Bergmann is Theology of Built Environments. His is kind of, it's based in Bardian Trinitarian theology, but it has this kind of neo-Marxist tinge to it. That's pretty interesting. There's a lot of resources that discuss architecture from various theological or spiritual perspectives or sacred places. Theology of architecture, though, Murray Ray is the one who's defined that.
Is that where listeners should start? Where should they start?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Charles, and we thank you, listeners, for listening. Give us a shout out, leave us a comment, and we'd love to hear from you. Share, like, all that stuff. Thank you for listening to Discerning.